Good morning, everybody. I'm Chris Jones. I'll be your guest speaker today. And because of the date and the privilege that I was given to speak to you, this is the message that I felt was appropriate. Today, I want to share with you in kind of this time we have and reflect on last week. Last week, in the religion that worships Christ, we thanked Jesus and celebrated what he did for us on his cross and his death and his resurrection. And this week, I want to talk about now, what does that mean for us? What do we do from here? What do we do with that? See, last week in religion, we remembered what he did. And this week, through discipleship, we should follow and do what he did. Sorry, my slides are giving me a little bit of grief. But in Matthew chapter 16, verses 24 through 25, Jesus says, "Deny yourself, pick up your cross and follow me, that whosoever loses their life for my sake shall find it." That sounds counterintuitive. There's a lot of different ways that can be interpreted. And today I'd like to just give you one of how I would see it anyway, one of many, I'm sure. But there's 5 things that Jesus demonstrates last week that I think that we are to follow symbolically in our life and what will help us get to this life that he's talking about, which doesn't mean just life after we die, but it also means life here and now. There's 5 things that Jesus demonstrates. First is the Garden of Gethsemane, the cross, the tomb, the cave, I call it, the resurrection, and then witnesses. It is in the Garden of Gethsemane that under great duress, Jesus goes to pray, "Father, let this cup pass from me." We don't ever really parse that out and talk about what that means. And then ultimately, your will be done. I think in modern terms, that means Jesus, under great duress and with a great amount of suffering about to come, Jesus was praying, "God, change my circumstances. I don't want to do this. Please change my circumstances." But he continued until he came to the piece of, "But your will be done." And it is when he gives up his will that he goes to the cross. It is on the cross that symbolically we, in our will of what we want, our ego, our pride, our arrogance has to go and die for what he wants, which takes us then to the tomb or the cave. The tomb or the cave is the longest part of the process that Jesus demonstrates for us. It's 3 days from outside of witnessing. From the Garden of Gethsemane to the resurrection, this is the longest piece. It is in here that through the circumstances, Jesus is transformed. Jesus isn't restored. Jesus goes through a transformation. They're 2 different things. And when this is done, okay. There we go. When it's done, Jesus resurrects. Maybe I'll get a different way of getting to these slides. I'm sorry. Hold on one second. Okay, there we go. But in resurrection, again, Jesus isn't restored. Jesus is transformed. And he still bears the scars of the circumstances he went through. However, the scars will bear witness to him in ways these words could never do it. And then Jesus goes on with witnessing. For 40 days, Jesus witnesses. In James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4, James tells us to embrace, a word in the Greek was parasmos, but embrace testings, trials, and tribulations, that as we go through them, that our patience, our endurance is put to the test. And through this, there's this thing that happens to us that we mature and we begin to grow and we become stronger for the course. 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 6 through 7, Peter uses the same word, parasmos, but he says it's through a season, possibly through a season, that through parasmos, testings, trials, and tribulations, he's talking about circumstances you don't want, but through this, we are developed, we are forged, and we are purified. There's things taken out of us, and what is left is the desired part. And in Romans 5, 1 through 5, Paul gives us a word from the Greek thalipsis, which means to constrict and put a great deal of pressure on. And Paul says that through thalipsis, or suffering, that it produces this endurance that produces in us character. And that character produces hope. Now, I think from a religious aspect or even just a very literal aspect, you can land on this idea that hard times make strong people. That adversity sorts us out, and I absolutely agree with that. I think that's correct. And that going through these difficult times, it makes us stronger for what we have to endure. But I think there's another aspect of this, and it's the spiritual aspect. And I think that these verses, if you go deeper, are referring to what Jesus was talking about in this process. I think if we parsed it out like that and put it in through the lens of what Jesus was saying, we start to realize that through suffering and through some of the things that we have to go through, we are transformed to look like Christ in discipleship. And when you have the character of Christ, you're going to bring hope to others. That it is, in this, there's this antidote to the suffering in a weird way that takes us to life. So I'm going to share some of my story and hopefully at least give you my perspective on kind of what this could mean. And this is just my story. There's other people in what I'm about to tell you, and their stories are probably more important than mine. And so I don't mean to make this sound like that mine is the most important and mine's the one you need to hear, because I don't mean it like that at all. It's just my experience and what I've went through. But on December 13th, 2006, to give you context, I was a general manager or store manager for a big box home improvement retailer. The previous year, I'd been manager of the year and knew that 2006 was just to be a maintain year, and that after all I had to do was get through it. And after this year, then it was onward and upward. There was already plans for me to go into district manager training at the beginning of 2007, and then onward and upward. All I had to do was get through one last piece, and it was an inventory. And an inventory lasted about a week back then in these boxes. But it started months in advance. It would just be quietly a couple people, and it would build and build till there would be more people involved in the store until you get to the week, and then it felt like the rafters was shaking. It was just chaotic. It was controlled chaos is a good way to put it. And Wednesday is kind of the crescendo of it all. It is the point where you feel like you're just barely hanging on and everything is just going nuts. I mean, you've got people in your store that's not typically in your store. You're doing things you normally wouldn't do. It's just a crazy time. And for me, December 13th, 2006 was my Wednesday, which was a great year or a great time of year to have an inventory. It's December. It was a slow time of year, so we only had about 160-ish employees. It was a little easier to kind of control everything. And I remember this morning very well. I got to the store at about 4:30 a.m. And I remember walking in feeling overly confident because I knew I had this. I knew that all my plans, all my preparation, and everything I'd put into this, that it was going to land and it was going to be good. And I felt like this was just one of those quiet moments where you felt good about yourself and you felt good about your life. And I was just overconfident about where I was going and what I was going to do. And then about 2:30 to 3:30, p.m. that day. So it was already a long day. Like I said, we had about 160-ish employees. It was a lot going on. But one of those employees, his name was Paul Brewer. I didn't know much about Paul. I had hired him. I knew that he was a retired farrier. I knew that customers really liked him and the employees loved him. But Paul was there, and Paul was part of the team, and he was working that day. Between 2:30 and 3:30, again, I was in the training room, which was kind of the heart of this inventory. Someone ran into the training room and just said, Paul fell. And my team jumped up and ran. I got behind them. And when I got there, I realized Paul had fallen from a very tall ladder. And I also knew as soon as I saw Paul, he wasn't going to make it. And my heart sunk. I was proud of my team. They immediately jumped in, started performing CPR and first aid. They did a great job. I immediately got on the phone calling 911. I was sure there was a sea of calls going out to 911. And as soon as I knew that EMS was on their way, Hannah, my HR manager, who's here today, told her, I said, you can call the family and then get to the hospital and be there to act as a liaison so they're not in the dark wondering what's going on. It was a hard day. I was tired. I thought my day was almost over and my day was just starting. I had to put on a different hat. I've never worn that hat before in leadership. But for the next 7 hours, it was chaos. Control was gone. It was just chaos. It was upheaval. I have memories from that time that I just don't want. I just don't want them. And it was just surreal, and it was a blur, things just running and crazy and having to do things. And I didn't get out of there and get to go home till 1:30 in the morning. It was a long day. I remembered walking into my home. My family was asleep. The lights were out. They forgot to leave the lights on. And as I walked into the dark, I fumbled around in the living room, and I found a table lamp. And I turned it on the lowest setting, which was just kind of this glow from underneath. And it just kind of lit the floor and slightly up the wall. I sat quietly in the dark. It was my first time of really being alone that day in the quiet. And I got to be honest, in that moment, in the dark in my living room, I felt like my world had just collapsed in on me. It was hard. And I went and did something that I hadn't done in a long time. 1:30 in the morning, I'm digging around trying to find my Bible that I haven't seen in 7 years or so. And I go find my Bible. And then in this semi-dark setting, clutching my Bible, desperate, I started to pray. I started to pray, God, change my circumstances. This is my Garden of Gethsemane moment. Under a great amount of duress, I went in to my garden, to God. This is where we go to God when we are in those moments of just overwhelming suffering pending, And I started to just pray to God any way you can frame it up or verbalize it. God, change my circumstances. And I prayed hard. I didn't pray so hard I sweat blood like Jesus did. But I promise you I prayed hard, and looking back and I can identify. And I continued to pray this, desperate. And I clutched my Bible, and I did something I don't recommend, but at the time that's what I did. I clutched my Bible, clenched my eyes, and I just looked up and I said, God, help. And I just randomly opened the Bible and I looked down in these dim lights, and I realized I'd turned to 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9, which says, my grace is sufficient for thee, my strength is made perfect in weakness. Now, I'm going to be honest, I didn't want to hear this. I wanted to hear something from Psalms. I wanted to hear something that was comforting. I wanted to hear something about restoration and healing. Cast your cares on me. But that's not what I heard. What I heard was, this is your cup. This isn't going to change, but you'll get through it. Jesus at that point says, your will be done, and walks forward into this process. Chris, on the other hand, said, nope. And I shut the Bible, and I sat it down, and I walked away. Which took me back to December 13th of 2006, where I started to just run from. My promotion wasn't going to happen because the company put me on the back burner to wait and see what happened with me, because leaders typically don't react well in that situation. And the truth is, I wasn't. I carried a lot of guilt. I felt so responsible. As a leader, you feel responsible for everything that happens for the people that work for you. And I felt responsible. I felt so guilty. And I just started to just run on pride and ego that I can do this and I will do this. Just using discipline, just get through it, just get through it, just get through it. And just trying to work through it. Going back to the hard times makes strong people. It's like, Chris, you gotta go. You can't stay here. You have to go. But the more I ran with that mentality, the more I realized I was running in the wrong direction. And I would continue to run like that, and I would continue to run in pride. But I got to be honest, there was PTSD, I'm sure, and some other trauma-based problems. And it felt like there was some poison in me, a dark poison that just started to slowly grow. That when Paul fell, something in me had fallen. So I pushed on and I kept pushing, and years go by, and every December, I'd be looking for the date, trying to find the 13th, because I'd have increased anxiety and stress about that day. Talk about a manager walking around the store telling people to get off ladders. That was my day. It was a struggle. But more of Chris started to go away, and more of this just started to take its place. And I continued to run, and I continued to run and just do it like this and do it with pride until I got to 2012, where I had changed and I was losing all of my strength as a leader. And the company that had seen me as a champion and in their future of what the company I used to work for used to look like in the future, they invited me to leave without option to stay. And some of you are going to be able to relate what I'm about to say to this, but when you get so wrapped up that what you do for a living becomes your identity, so in that moment, I felt like the bus had dropped me off in the middle of nowhere, and the bus just left and took my identity with it. I was lost. I was in a lot of pain. I was suffering. If I was an expert on anything, it was how do you suffer? I could tell you about that. So what did I do? Did I go back where I should have and get started back on the process? I did not. I just kept going because let me tell you, I got a lot of pride and I got a lot of arrogance and ego. So I just kept running. I'll just do it myself. And I just kept going and going until I get to the end of 2020. And at the end of 2020, I find myself in a big empty house going through yet another divorce. Lost all my 401k because I chose to invest it in something that if I would have thought about it or studied about it for 15, 20 minutes, I said, absolutely not. I wasn't in a good place. I wasn't thinking right. But there I am, running on my own ego. And part of this, going through this process at the end of the year of this divorce, was this house had to be fixed up, had to be sold. I had to do it. It was on me. The money would be divvied out appropriately, though. It was cordial. And I'm working, getting it fixed up, and I run into a major problem, which would end up being the undoing for me. But I got to a point where I was on the floor working, and it was meticulous, hard, dirty work, and it was literally several hours to make it afoot, and I had a whole level to do. It was hard. It's one of those moments that where you're just going and you're feeding yourself just things like we rest when we're done, not when we're tired. A lion doesn't tell you it's a lion, it's just a lion, and I'm just going. No, I'm just going to make this happen and go. And then I had one of those moments. And in this moment, I realized I don't have anything. Is this what I've come to with all of my running and doing it my way, that I've run to a house. This is all I got left. Everything else is gone. Everything that was of true value has fallen away from me. And there was so little of me left, I just kind of ran out of myself. I ran out of my pride and my arrogance and my ego. I just kind of ran out of me. And I was on the floor working, and I remember just having a moment of clarity and saying, all right, God, I can't. I'm done. I can't do this. I don't have anything left. And I asked God, please, God, change my circumstances. Don't make me go through this one. And I will tell you, I'm not going to go into it, but I believe God did change my circumstances. God did fix it. It did happen. Everything sold. Everything was fine. I was rushing around at that time, just trying to get everything done. There's no housing at the time to get. We're in the middle of the pandemic. We're locked down. It's a weird time. So I just want to buy a little house that I could just buy and fix it up and live in it and chill for a little bit, get it together. But there's no house, so I just rent a one-bedroom apartment. Me and a cat that I inherited in a divorce that I did not want. But, yeah. Well, that was Saturday. I get moved in. I'm rushing around after everything that's happened. And I wake up early on Sunday morning as I rise early. And I go sit in the living room with everything I've got to unpack and realize I really don't have nothing to do now. All I have to do is unpack and settle in. And I know that it's time. I know that I need to go back. So I hope that I still have my Bible. So I start digging around. I was like, I hope I still have that thing. I don't know. So I go find it. Thank God I still have it. And I go sit down in the living room in a chair. And I just start praying again. I'm using a lot of words like God restore, God bring back, God replace, God do this, God do this. Please, God, change my circumstances. And then I go get my Bible, and I clutch it just like I did that night. And I look up, close my eyes, and again, I just say, God, help, and I randomly open the Bible. And I promise you, I opened it to 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9, just like I had 14 years earlier. I promise you. Me and ChatGPT-4, we talk a lot, and I asked ChatGPT-4, what's the odds of these circumstances of that happening? ChatGPT says 3.2 million to 1. Did you have a better chance 3 times over of winning the lottery? I was like, okay. So when I seen that, as soon as I seen that scripture, I immediately didn't know, but I knew I was back. God was right where I left him. The antidote to the poison hadn't changed. It was still the same. Except this time I didn't shut the Bible. I kept reading. And as I started to read, things started opening up to me, and things started looking different in this scripture. It started to mean different things. I talked about it, I think, the last time I talked here about it. And it was just, it brought so much hope. I had not had hope for over 14 years, and it just brought hope. And it was about an hour or so, I kind of got finished, and I felt like the prodigal son. I felt like I came back to God. I felt like I was back where I was supposed to be. And I wanted to hear about Jesus. I just wanted to stay in that mindset. And I turned on the TV and started listening to preaching and teaching about Jesus. And I sat there early that morning listening. And a message came on. It was kind of an inspiring message, but there was something that was said during the message that was incredibly impactful when I heard it. And I knew it was important even though I didn't understand it. And it was this. This is what the message had said, the messenger. If God's not changing the circumstances you're praying about, then God is using those circumstances to change you. I didn't know what that meant, but I knew it was important. And it did. It started to kind of shift me a little bit in my perspective of what I was praying. But I didn't stop praying what I was praying. I still was praying God change my circumstances. Fix, restore, bring back my ideas. Well, I get up and I'm working around the house, getting unpacked and cleaning, and I've still got that going. I still want to hear something motivating and inspiring about Jesus. I hear that message come on again. I said, yeah, it's the message I heard earlier. And then I hear that phrase again, that if God isn't changing the circumstances you're praying about, then God is going to use those circumstances to change you. And as soon as I heard it again, it hit me just as hard, but it began to change my perspective. And I was like, I don't even know what that means. But I started kind of thinking about it. Well, you get through the day and I get finished up and I go sit down and I'm watching the TV because I'm still listening. I still want to hear the messages and the teaching and hear about Jesus. And that comes on again, except this time I grab my phone because I want to record it. Because I know it's important. So I wait for it, and when it comes up, I record it. I still got it today. If God isn't changing the circumstances you're praying about, then God is going to use those circumstances to change you. And it shifted my ideas a little more, and then I got it. And it was at that point that I realized that I needed to pray differently and think differently. So I prayed, God, change my circumstances. Please fix, restore, but your will be done. What you want above what I want, I submit it to you, I give it to you. Which led me to my cross. And it was on this cross that my will, the things I want had to go to, my pride, my arrogance, my ego, and I had to just submit. Sometimes the visions of what we expect for our lives are so big they get in the way of our lives. And that's kind of what was happening to me. And as soon as I prayed that, well, the tomb or the cave, that's where I went. Now, I was in the tomb, the cave, I would call it the cocoon, for several months. And every morning I would get up and I would read at least an hour or so, the Bible, and things would open up and it would just give me a lot of hope. And I felt, and it's hard to describe, but I felt like I was in a place where something was happening. There was change going on in me, but it was so gentle and it was so slow. It was a process. And I just felt so much hope. It's like a nurturing healing. That's the only way I know to describe it. It was just weird. It wasn't a religious experience. It was like a spiritual thing, but it was so gentle. So like the wind, like you could just walk away from it and stop it. You just had to keep showing up, you know. And as I kept showing up, I just felt hopeful and things began to change me. I started to transform. And when I got to a really, really, really difficult point because I was having issues with my pride. And I know it sounds funny because my pride went to the cross. Well, that just means it goes to the cross for it to be dealt with. But the truth is, pride's like a weed that grows in your psyche that you got to maintain daily and keep it weeded out. And mine had been left unchecked for so long, I had trees of pride, you know. And so that had to be dealt with. I needed to get to a place where I could be humbled so I could get to a different place in my mind. And weeks went by and my pride, everything is just stimulating my pride and going off. And I got James chapter 1, verses 2-4, and that's my mantra. Count it all joy, count it all joy. I'm going through this in this very difficult time. And I finally get to a place where I'm starting to wonder, am I crazy? I've been here for months. We're in a pandemic, things are shut down, things are weird. And things are weird for me. And I'm like, I think I've lost my mind. So I just want to hear it again, one more time. That God, if he isn't changing your circumstances, and he's using those circumstances to change you. And so I wanted to hear that. So I get my phone up and I go find that voice memo. And when I see the voice memo, I realize the date. The date was December 13th of 2020, 14 years to the day that I had been there before. Now I know, well, anything can happen, but the fact that I didn't realize that that date was here and that I didn't know it was coming and that I had no anxiety, that instead I went to a different off-ramp, a different place, on the very day that I'd picked up the Bible the second time and heard that message 3 times. To me, I get it, it's subjective, but I believed I was right where I was supposed to be. And I was filled with a tremendous amount of hope. And then I decided I want to go back to Paul Brewer's resting place. I wanted to visit his grave. And I hadn't been there since his funeral. I had been running and running and running. I didn't even know where the place was. And I lived in that town anymore, so I called Hannah, the HR manager that I had worked with at that time, and she helped me find the cemetery. And when I was looking around to try to find it, I did find it. And as I looked down, I realized that I'd been healed of the poison. And in its place was other stuff growing. It's been several months that I had peace. I hadn't known peace for 14 years. And it hadn't dawned on me that I had gotten to a place of peace. I had love, joy, peace, patience. They talk about it in Galatians 5:22 and 23. These things were just growing in me and starting to kind of come out like for other people. It was a foreign thing. I didn't realize it at the time, but looking back, I would tell you that was my time of resurrection. We would say I was born again. I was saved. I was a new creature in Christ, but not in the religious context, in a different way. The poison had been replaced with a healing. I was free. I was free. But I got to tell you, I wasn't restored. I was transformed. I still bear the scars of 14 years of suffering. And I hope that they witness on behalf of Jesus for what can happen when you go through something that traumatic. And now I'm just doing my best to love others and help others when I can and just live life. Suffering. It's a part of life. I think the big question we have is, why does God allow suffering? I think if God takes suffering from us, he has to take free will. Because the truth is, the vast majority of suffering we experience is in humanity. It goes back to every human being that's ever breathed and made a choice and a decision, that we all live downstream of that our experience is a culmination of all of humanity and where it's led us. Selfish choices affect other people. I think somehow or some way that selfishness is what brings us suffering. Now, I get in the story, there is a place for discipline versus immediate gratification, and that hard times make strong people. I get it. There's a place for that in this story. But there's also this other thing, that in the suffering, that we don't have to just accept anything that comes our way. I remember that Jesus was praying so hard he sweat blood to change my circumstances. So I think that means ask God to change your circumstances. Get in there and push and fight, but if it's your cup to drink, man, head to the Garden of Gethsemane. Get with God, and whatever it is, put it on the cross. There's something in suffering that happens to us that when it happens, distractions in life, and we've all got them. It helps us deal with the stressors of life as we go through it, these distractions, whether it's gaming or binge watching or whatever you do for fun that helps you, that relieves the stress of life, that in these traumatic times of suffering, none of that helps. You don't want any distractions. You don't want any part of that whatsoever. All you want is relief. That's these moments of these pains. And in those moments of pain, it was like me, where all the skills that you've learned in life of how to navigate life, that you start to see as your identity. It's a false identity. It's not really you. This is just a culmination of your experiences and skill sets that you've learned on how to navigate life. But that's not necessarily you. But all of that is kind of pulled away, and the only thing that's left is the true you, your essence, your core of who you really are. And when we go to God with our hands open, with no false ideas of where we're at, we become malleable. Does that mean I think that God has suffering there for a purpose to make us come to him? Absolutely not. Suffering, again, is just a part of the human condition. I think God sent Jesus because we was suffering. And Jesus says, I came that you might have life and you might have it more abundantly. And sometimes how you have to get there is counterintuitive, and you have to die to self. And it takes us to life. Well, there we go. That's better. Life, not necessarily how we've defined it, what we think it should be. We have ideas of in our hopes of what we want it to be. And sometimes I think we go to God and we want him to serve us, to help us get to what we believe life is. Life sometimes is nothing what you expected. My life is, I am nothing like I used to be before that accident, nor after. I'm something totally different. But I will tell you, I'm in a much, much, much better place. Life. I think that Jesus did so much for us, and I think there's so much layers for it. But there's also this example he gave us, to be a disciple and to follow him and to deny ourselves, pick up the cross and follow him and lose our life for his sake, and then we find it. It's not just talking about when we die. It's talking about here and now, that we can have life even though there's suffering.